seen and heard you already heroically defending this pile of nonsensical verbiage that Keir Starmer came out with today. He calls it his Society of Societies. What on earth is he on about? Something about, like, if you serve your neighbours and you help everyone else, the country will serve you. I mean, not since David Cameron's ludicrous, laughable big society have I come across something quite so absurd. This is nonsense. And by the way, haven't the Tories got a point that the wokies invaded the National Trust and ruined a much-loved national institution?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think we shouldn't have politicians afraid to talk about society, talk about volunteerism.
They should be afraid to bore us, though, right?
Well, because millions of people volunteer every week. Volunteers are the backbone of so much of British life. And what Keir's trying to do today is celebrate that. His big phrase was the Society of Service. And his life has been about public service.
What does that mean?
It means that he's celebrating.
I don't want to serve anyone. What's it going to do for me?
Well, I'm sure that you've relied on volunteers or your family.
Yeah, would you be referring, Matthew, to all the volunteers who've quit the National Trust because they've been made to wear rainbow lanyards because they're sick of every artefact in these houses with some kind of warning about slavery? It's not right to say the Tories started this culture war. The National Trust started it. And by the way, we don't like the Royal National Lifeboat Institute acting as a taxi service going into French waters to bring migrants back here. So he's the one who's inventing some kind of war that the Tories are doing something wrong here. No, he is.
Well, it's interesting that every time the National Trust has an election and the people who are against the agenda that they have put up candidates and they lose. I'm somebody who's been to, a National Trust lesbian gay event and it was perfectly in keeping with the house. It was in a house where, guess what, one of the owners was a theatre designer in the 30s and it was telling his story, and that sort of thing is absolutely right. Nobody is saying that we should brush away the past.
What about all the volunteers that have left the National Trust because they're made to wear...
I'm not in favour of forcing people to wear rainbow lanyards. It should be there as a choice.
Silly trigger warnings on artefacts.
I think
this guy once met someone who...
acceptable. I'm not in favour of pushing statues down. I am in favour of contextualising our history. So yes, if we have slightly different labels than we had 30 years ago, but we should be celebrating our history, our heritage, which the National Trust does, and the government is wrong to demonise it.
I think my favourite thing is the 2020 report that we were told about earlier, where the National Trust considers visiting their properties as an outdated mansion experience.
Yeah.
That's absolutely brilliant. Elysian Fields.
Elysian
Fields.
That's your name from now on.
Thank you. I love that. It's great. It's great, isn't it? Politically, what on earth is he doing here? Because, I get the impression that the Labour Party have sort of said to Keir Starmer, best not to say much about anything, really. Just let the Conservatives self-immolate. And so talking in platitudes, clearly, is a lot of what this speech seems to be about. There doesn't seem to be a policy here. If you try and look under a microscope for one, you're going to struggle to find anything. But the problem is there are lots of characters around him who are shouting and making noises and making headlines, and a lot of them have been very unhelpful.
Definitely. So you're right in saying that it's something that Keir Starmer doesn't like to talk about. He usually shies away from culture war issues. He usually tries to just leave that to people towards the right of the political spectrum, because then now he can turn around and say, oh, the Tories are trying to evoke culture wars and it's not something that I would do as the leader. I avoid all this silly nonsense is the way that he'd classify it, and say that he's actually focusing on bigger issues, ones that are more important. That's the way that he can kind of play that game here. So by doing this, he's now just saying that all of this, all this talk about these things, it's not as important as some of the issues that he wants to face as the Labour leader.
Yeah, which is what left-wingers do. They go, it's a cost of living crisis. Never mind about all this woke stuff. That's been created in order to cause cultural war. No, people do care about this. And talking of Keir and his wokery, has he worked out yet that women can't have penises?
He's got a very clear answer now.
He's late in life. He's obviously been to school.
He's floundered in some interviews because he wanted to be fair to transgender people, but...
That's not fair, that's stating a lie.
He didn't want to put his size 10 into what is a very sensitive debate, but Labour's absolutely clear that it's against self-identification on transgender
And he now accepts a woman cannot have a penis.
I believe so.
That's good.